Richard Speck. In 1996, a Chicago journalist named Bill Curtis walked into a television studio with a videotape that would trigger a criminal investigation, embarrass the entire Illinois prison system, and force the state attorney general to open a corruption case. The tape had been filmed 8 years earlier, in 1988, inside Stateville Correctional Center. It had been recorded using prison video equipment that was supposed to be reserved for staff. And the man staring into the camera, laughing about how much fun he was having behind bars, was one of the most notorious mass killers in American history. His name was Richard Speck, and by the time that tape aired, he had already been dead for 5 years. To understand how a convicted killer ended up on camera inside a maximum security prison, drinking, using drugs, and boasting that if the outside world only knew how good he had it, they would turn him loose, you have to go back to the summer of 1966. Speck was born in Illinois in December of 1941, one of 8 children in a working-class family. By his mid-20s, he was a drifter, a former merchant seaman with more than 20 prior arrests, a heavy drinker, and the owner of a tattoo on his forearm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." In the summer of 1966, he was 24 years old and moving between cheap rooms on the south side of Chicago. On the night of July 13th, going into July 14th, Speck broke into a townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. The house was rented by student nurses training at South Chicago Community Hospital. Over the next 4 to 5 hours, Speck took the lives of 8 of those young women. He bound them one by one and led them, sometimes individually, sometimes in pairs, into separate rooms. He assaulted one of them before killing her. All 8 were in their early 20s. All 8 died inside a single house on a single night. A 9th nurse, a young woman named Corazon Amurao, survived by rolling under a bed and hiding there for hours after Speck left. She stayed motionless until she was certain he was gone. She would later identify Speck in court, and her testimony would become the single most important piece of evidence the prosecution would put in front of the jury. 2 days later, Speck was picked up at Cook County Hospital after a failed suicide attempt. A doctor treating him noticed the tattoo on his forearm and realized he was staring at the man whose description had been on every front page in the country. How does a case that had shocked the entire city of Chicago end up producing one of the fastest verdicts in Illinois history? The Cook County State's Attorney's Office prosecuted him, with a young assistant named William Martin leading the case. Because of the overwhelming pre-trial publicity, the trial itself was moved on a change of venue to Peoria. On April 15, 1967, after just 49 minutes of deliberation, the jury convicted Speck on all 8 counts of murder. On June 5th of that same year, he was sentenced to death. The Illinois Supreme Court affirmed the conviction the following year, but Speck would never be executed. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court's ruling in Furman v. Georgia voided every death sentence in the country. Speck's punishment was converted to a term of 400 to 1,200 years, later corrected to 100 to 300 years. He was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet to serve out the rest of his life. And that is where the video comes in. The tape Bill Curtis played on Chicago television in 1996 had been filmed inside Stateville in 1988. It showed Speck flashing money, using drugs, and telling anyone who cared to listen how easy prison had become for him. He was recorded engaged in sexual activity with another inmate. He looked into the lens and said that if the outside world had any idea how good he had it, they would set him free. The Illinois Attorney General Jim Ryan opened an investigation. Legislative hearings followed, and the conclusion officials reached was blunt. The contraband, the drugs, and the video equipment itself were all coming in through corrections staff. A 30-year Stateville officer named Martin Shiflett later admitted on camera that he personally handed Speck paint and a paintbrush so the inmate could decorate his cell. Speck, he said, was easily influenced. The country's most infamous mass killer had been supervised by men who let him decorate. By the time the tape aired, Speck was already gone. On December 5, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday, he suffered a heart attack inside Stateville and died in custody. As of today, his remains were cremated and, according to the official record, scattered at an undisclosed location in Illinois. The 8 young women he took from their families in Jeffrey Manor are buried across the Chicago area and beyond, still remembered decades later by the hospital where they had been training and by the profession they never got to enter. Speck's story is one where the failure was not really in the courtroom. It was inside the walls that were supposed to hold him. What follows is a story where the walls held the man, but not what he was still able to reach through them. LeBar Man Span. Between late 2003 and the middle of 2007, the Cook County Sheriff's Office filed 17 separate disciplinary complaints against a single inmate. Threats against officers. Threats against officers' families. A homemade weapon fashioned from 3 pens taped together into a point. And one incident, in January of 2005, where the inmate rolled his own wheelchair backwards onto a corrections officer's feet and legs, over and over, until the guard had to be taken to the jail hospital's emergency room. 17 citations. 58 total days of restrictive custody served. And in 11 of those 17 cases, the jail's own disciplinary board never held a timely hearing at all. According to a Chicago Sun-Times investigation by reporter Sam Charles, published in October of 2017, the inmate at the center of every one of those complaints was a man named LeBar Span, known on the West Side as Bro Man. Span had grown up on Chicago's West Side. His felony record stretched back to 1996, when he was arrested at 17 for cocaine manufacture and delivery. By the time he entered his 20s, he was one of the highest-ranking leaders of the Four Corner Hustlers, a street gang that dominated a stretch of West Side territory. In 1999, Span was shot and paralyzed from the waist down. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. It did not slow him down. Federal prosecutors would eventually accuse him of ordering or committing 4 separate murders. Maximilian McDaniel, killed in July of 2000. George King, killed in April of 2003. Willie Woods, killed later that same April. And Rudy Rangel, a rival boss known on the street as Cato and one of the highest-ranking leaders of the Latin Kings, killed in June of 2003. Federal prosecutors would later describe every one of those killings as cold, calculated, and premeditated. But for years, no case could stick. Span was twice acquitted of murder in Illinois State Court. 2 juries, 2 verdicts, and each time he walked out of the courtroom and back onto the street. What state prosecutors could not do, federal prosecutors would eventually finish under the racketeering statutes. Before the federal case ever reached trial, though, Span was already sitting inside Cook County Jail. And that is where the trouble the sheriff's office would document over the next several years began. The Sun-Times reporter went through the disciplinary records line by line. Span had threatened to have officers killed. He had threatened their families. He had told one inmate plainly that he ran the compound and that no matter where anyone went inside it, he would have them cut. He had told a corrections officer that he and his gang had committed numerous unsolved murders and that the officer would be next. Separate reporting by WGN documented that a high-ranking gang informant told police Spann had used his time inside the jail to give the order to accelerate a war on the outside. He was not being warehoused. He was still operating. So how does a paralyzed inmate accumulate 17 disciplinary citations in less than 4 years and serve only 58 days of restrictive custody for it? The Sun-Times reporting suggested the answer had less to do with Spann and more to do with a jail disciplinary system that failed to hold timely hearings, failed to enforce its own sanctions, and repeatedly let the clock run out. The result, over roughly 4 years, was a paralyzed defendant continuing to run a street operation from a jail bunk while facing almost no meaningful internal consequences for the way he treated the staff around him. The federal case took longer than anyone expected. In November of 2021, Spann was convicted of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of murder in aid of racketeering, and extortion. But that conviction was undone after revelations that a former prosecutor on the case had made an unauthorized promise to a key witness. The government retried him. On December 15, 2025, after a 6-week retrial, a federal jury convicted Spann again. On April 20, 2026, United States District Judge Thomas Durkin sentenced Spann to life in federal prison. Judge Durkin told him in open court that he would breathe his last breath in a cell, that he would die inside, and that no sentence handed down that day would ever bring back the 4 men his jury had found him responsible for killing. Spann laughed. He insisted from the defense table that he had nothing to do with the 4 corner hustlers. As of today, Spann is serving that life sentence in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. His 4 state-level victims and their families are still waiting for the version of the story that ends the way state court could never make it end. Spann's threats came from inside a jail he had already been sent to. The next case is one where the violence came from the street. But when the smoke cleared, the man responsible would find himself inside the same complex, applauded by other inmates for what he had just done. Shomari Leggett. On the afternoon of February 13, 2018, a Chicago police commander named Paul Bauer was walking near the Thompson Center in downtown Chicago when a radio call came over his handset about a suspect being chased by other officers nearby. Bauer, a 53-year-old veteran and the highest-ranking Chicago officer in decades to die on duty, took off toward the description. He caught up to the suspect at the top of a stairwell. The 2 men struggled. They tumbled down the stairs together. And at the bottom, the suspect drew a semi-automatic pistol loaded with an extended magazine and shot Commander Bauer 6 times. The suspect was wearing body armor. He was carrying roughly 30 rounds of ammunition. He had been a convicted felon 4 times over. His name was Shomari Leggett, and prosecutors would later describe him, in front of a jury, as a walking, talking felony. Leggett had a criminal history that stretched back years, 4 prior felony convictions, a career built entirely outside legitimate work. On the morning that he encountered Commander Bauer, he was carrying the pistol illegally, wearing body armor illegally, and moving through the downtown business district in a way that other officers had noticed and started to follow. Bauer had not been assigned to that pursuit. He had simply heard the call, recognized the description of the man other officers were looking for, and decided that he was close enough to help. He was in plain view of the Thompson Center, one of the busiest government buildings downtown, in the middle of a workday. That decision cost him his life. Bauer had spent more than 3 decades on the force. He had been promoted repeatedly. Commanders in the Chicago Police Department are not usually the officers who chase down suspects on foot. But Bauer had built his career on being the kind of supervisor who did not stay behind a desk, and on the day he died, that was exactly what he did. The Chicago Police Department that Commander Bauer had served for so long responded with one of the largest funeral processions in recent memory. Bauer was survived by his wife, Erin, and their young daughter, Grace. The public reaction to his death was overwhelming, but the reaction inside the walls of Cook County Jail, when Leggett was first brought in, was very different. Surveillance video from a holding cell captured the moment other detainees realized who had just been booked. Roughly 27 inmates were in the room. 4 or 5 of them began to clap. According to the Associated Press and CBS, the sheriff's chief policy officer at the time, Kara Smith, confirmed that 5 inmates who had applauded were transferred overnight out of the Chicago jail complex and moved to another facility in southern Illinois. The applause was not Leggett's own misconduct. It was the reaction of other men in custody to what he had just done. But it captured the atmosphere that would follow him into the courtroom, and it captured something about the environment the Cook County Sheriff's Office was trying to manage on the day the news broke. What kind of defense do you mount when a police commander's body camera was not the only recording of what happened, when the entire encounter was witnessed by officers already pursuing you, and when your gun, your ammunition, and your body armor are all on the evidence table? Leggett's answer was self-defense. He would tell the jury that he did not know Bauer was a police officer. He would offer no supporting evidence for that claim. The trial ran 7 days in front of Judge Erica Reddick, with prosecutors walking the jury through the body camera footage, the ballistic evidence, and the testimony of the officers who had been chasing Leggett when Bauer stepped in to help. The jury deliberated for roughly 2 hours. On March 13, 2020, they returned a guilty verdict on all 6 counts. For a case with as much publicity as this one, and with a police commander as the victim, the swiftness of the verdict was itself notable. On October 28th of that same year, Judge Reddick sentenced Shomari Leggett to the only sentence Illinois law permitted for the murder of a police officer under these circumstances: mandatory life without parole. Leggett did not apologize to the Bauer family. He told the courtroom that he believed his prosecution had been unfair. He was led out of the room and transferred into the Illinois Department of Corrections. In November of 2023, the Illinois Appellate Court upheld his conviction on direct appeal. The court found no reversible error in Judge Reddick's handling of the trial. Leggett's self-defense argument, the court noted, had been presented to the jury and rejected on its merits. There would be no new trial. As of today, Shomari Leggett remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving that life sentence. Commander Paul Bauer is buried in the Chicago area, and the department he served continues to mark the anniversary of his death every February. Leggett's crime unfolded on a public sidewalk in the middle of a workday, in front of on-duty officers. The case that follows unfolded behind a closed door in a residential neighborhood on Chicago's far south side, in a house full of people who had spent the earlier part of the day sitting with the man who would later come back. Lionel Parks. On the night of December 17, 2016, a man wearing an ankle monitor issued by the Illinois Department of Corrections walked into a house on the 100 block of West 105th Street in the Fernwood neighborhood of Chicago's far south side. It was not his first visit that day. He had already been there twice before, spending time with the people inside, sharing conversation and a marijuana cigarette. On his third visit, he brought an armed accomplice with him, and before the night was over, 5 people inside that house would lose their lives. His name was Lionel Parks, He was on parole. And the man who answered the door, thinking a friend was coming back for another visit, had no way of knowing that Parks and the accomplice had come back with a very different intention. Parks had grown up in the Roseland area of Chicago's South Side. He had a criminal record long enough that the state had assigned him an electronic monitor as a condition of his release. On the day of the killings, that ankle bracelet placed him at the scene in real time, moving in and out of the house across the course of the evening. It would become one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence against him. The people inside the house on Fernwood were a family gathering. Elijah Jackson, a 36-year-old man, his sister Shakora Jackson, who was 40 and expecting a child, Shakora's daughter Natea Hines, who was 19, a man named Scott Thompson, who was 46, and Shakaya Jackson, also 19, who would fight for her life in a hospital bed for more than 10 months before her passing. A young child was in the house that evening as well, and thankfully was not physically harmed. A 22-year-old survivor in the room played dead as Parks and his accomplice moved through the house, and later gave investigators the identification that would drive the case. When Parks and the accomplice forced their way back into the home that night, they ordered everyone inside to lie face down on the floor. They ransacked the rooms looking for money and drugs, and before they left, the two of them took the lives of the people they had spent the earlier part of the day sitting with. The scene that Chicago police walked into hours later was one of the largest mass killings the South Side had seen in years. Ballistics, the ankle monitor data, and the surviving witnesses' identification all pointed in the same direction. How does the state build a case when there are no security cameras inside the home? When the men responsible moved through the rooms methodically, and when one of the only living witnesses spent the entire attack pretending not to be alive? The answer, in this case, was the monitor on Parks's ankle, the physical evidence at the scene, and the memory of a young man who had made himself as still as possible until the attackers were gone. The prosecution had a location record, an eyewitness, and a survivor who could describe both men who had entered. Together, those pieces gave the state a case a Cook County jury would need almost 7 years to see through to a verdict. Parks's trial in Cook County went to a jury in July of 2023. He was convicted of the mass killing. On September 21st of that same year, Judge William Gambini sentenced Lionel Parks to life in prison. Parks did not testify in his own defense. Judge Gambini's sentencing statement reflected the scale of what had happened inside the Fernwood house that December night. The accomplice who had come with him into the house that night has never been publicly identified or charged. That part of the story remains an open piece of the record. As of today, Parks remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving that life sentence. The Fernwood house where the family had gathered that December evening is still on the block where it always stood. The young child who was inside the home that night, unharmed but present through everything that happened, is now growing up somewhere in Chicago, part of an extended family that lost 5 members in a single night. The Fernwood case left 5 people gone, and 1 witness who had survived by playing dead. The next case involved a witness who survived a shooting inside a corner store, and a defendant who spent his time in county lockup trying to make sure that witness never made it into the courtroom. Samuel Gaydon. Sometime after Samuel Gaydon was booked into the Cook County Jail and awaiting trial for a double murder, corrections officers began flagging his outgoing mail and monitoring his telephone calls. What they intercepted, according to the sheriff's office and Cook County prosecutors, were letters and phone conversations in which Gaydon was trying to arrange the murder of one of the witnesses who was going to testify against him. The plot never came to fruition. The witness lived. But the fact that Gaydon had been willing to try, from inside the walls of the jail itself, would become part of the record that followed him into his sentencing. He was known on the South Side as Duke. His full name was Samuel Gaydon, and the double murder he was being held for had happened on a warm September night at a corner liquor store on South State Street. Gaydon had a record. On the night of the shooting, he was already wanted on a parole violation. Just after midnight on September 1st, 2010, he walked into State Garden Food and Liquors on the 5700 block of South State Street. He opened fire inside the store. 2 young men were killed: Marcus Marshall, who was 19, and Chantel Harris, who was 21. A third man, Chauncey Williams, was shot and wounded, but survived. The 3 of them had done nothing to earn what Gaydon brought into the store that night. The shooting itself was captured, in full, by multiple surveillance cameras inside the store. Williams, the surviving victim, later identified Gaydon. The store manager identified him. Investigators recovered the weapon used in the shooting. Ballistics matched it to the casings on the floor. DNA on the gun matched Gaydon. It was, from the state's perspective, one of the cleanest evidentiary pictures a prosecutor could ask for. And it was for that reason, according to the prosecution's later theory of the case, that Gaydon turned his attention from the shooting to the witnesses who would eventually have to sit on the stand and describe him. The evidence against him was overwhelming almost from the beginning. But rather than accept it, Gaydon used his time in the Cook County Jail to try to make one of those eyewitnesses disappear before he could ever take the stand. What does a case look like when the defendant, sitting in the county jail, is not just trying to beat the charges, but trying to make sure the witnesses never make it to the courtroom? The sheriff's office intercepted the letters. Investigators recorded the phone calls. Copies of both were preserved and turned over to the prosecution. When Gaydon's case went to trial, the jury heard about the plot against the witness alongside the evidence of the shooting itself. In September of 2016, the jury convicted Samuel Gaydon of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Judge Domenica Stevenson sentenced him to natural life in prison plus 20 additional years, a sentence designed to leave no legal room for eventual release. For the prosecutors on the case, the plot from inside the jail had confirmed something they had already come to believe about the man they were putting on trial. He had shown, from behind bars, exactly what he had been willing to do outside them. Gaydon appealed. In 2020, the Illinois Appellate Court affirmed the conviction on direct appeal, in a decision cited as People v. Gaydon. The court reviewed his arguments and rejected each one on the merits. His post-conviction petition was later dismissed by the trial court, and that dismissal was affirmed on appeal in 2023. Every level of the state court system that had reviewed his case had reached the same conclusion. There would be no reversal, no new trial, and no reduction of the natural life sentence Judge Stevenson had handed down. As of today, Samuel Gaydon remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving the sentence he received almost a decade ago. Marcus Marshall and Chantel Harris are buried in the Chicago area. Chauncey Williams, the man who survived being shot inside the store, and the man Gaydon had tried to have killed from inside the jail, is alive and continued to live his life outside the walls that finally closed around Gaydon for good. If you're finding this video worth your time, and you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do so. Subscribe so the next one lands in your feed. Ronald Kleiner. In June of 1993, more than 5 years after Dana Rinaldi was shot 5 times as she sat in her car in Palatine, Illinois, a grand jury heard testimony from 2 witnesses who had spent those years staying silent. One was the ex-girlfriend of the man they said had pulled the trigger. The other was that man's own uncle, a former Chicago police officer named John Apple. What they told the grand jury under oath would finally give investigators the case they had been trying to build since 1988. The man they named was Ronald Kleiner, and the case they were describing was the contract killing of a young woman whose own husband had paid to have it done. Kleiner had grown up in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was a childhood friend of a man named Michael Permanian, and the two of them had been part of a small circle of friends since they were teenagers. That circle would eventually include a man named Joseph Rinaldi. And in February of 1988, Joseph Rinaldi's wife Dana was shot to death outside the couple's home in the northwest suburbs. On the evening of February 18, 1988, Dana Rinaldi walked out to her car. She sat down in the driver's seat. She was shot 5 times in the face and head at close range. She died where she sat. The killing had all the marks of a professional job. There were no witnesses at the scene. There were no arrests. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, worked their sources, and followed every lead they had for years. Nothing produced a name. Palatine police, working the case alongside the Cook County Sheriff's Office, would eventually document years of interviews, ballistic work, and dead ends before the investigation moved to a grand jury. For more than 5 years, the case stayed cold. Investigators suspected from the beginning that Joseph Rinaldi had been involved in his own wife's death. Insurance money, marital problems, and a series of small inconsistencies in his account of the evening all pointed in his direction. They could not prove it. Not until 1993, when Kleiner's ex-girlfriend and Kleiner's own uncle sat down in front of a grand jury and told them what they said Kleiner had told them. Joseph Rinaldi, according to the prosecution's case, had paid Kleiner and Permanian to kill his wife. Rinaldi would later plead guilty and testify against the others. The state's theory was that Kleiner had been the shooter, that Permanian had been the driver, and that Rinaldi had been the man who wanted the outcome. Rinaldi's decision to take a plea and testify would eventually give prosecutors a witness inside the conspiracy, on top of the 2 witnesses who had come forward on their own. How does a case that had gone cold for more than 5 years finally produce 3 convictions in the same set of proceedings? The answer was the grand jury testimony followed by Rinaldi's cooperation. Kleiner's case went to trial in 1996. He was convicted of Dana Rinaldi's murder. He waived a jury for sentencing and elected to have his sentence handed down by a judge. He was sentenced to death. Michael Permanian was sentenced to 75 years. Joseph Rinaldi, who had testified for the state, was sentenced to 60 years. All 3 men would eventually be transferred into the Illinois Department of Corrections. Kleiner appealed. In 1998, the Illinois Supreme Court affirmed his conviction on direct appeal. He would spend the next several years pursuing DNA testing and post-conviction relief. He maintained his innocence throughout, and by his later years he was represented by wrongful conviction advocates, including the investigator Paul Ciolino. In 2003, Governor George Ryan commuted Kleiner's death sentence to natural life in prison, along with the sentences of every other man then on Illinois' death row. Kleiner continued to file post-conviction motions for the rest of his life. He had supporters who argued that his conviction had been built on unreliable testimony from witnesses with reasons to shape their accounts. Advocates in that campaign pointed out that his uncle and his ex-girlfriend had waited more than 5 years to come forward, that Rinaldi had a plea deal to protect, and that the state's case had ultimately turned on what those 3 people said. The state's response throughout the appeals was that the evidence had been consistent, that the jury had heard the arguments, and that every level of the Illinois court system had upheld the verdict. A hearing on one of his post-conviction motions was scheduled for October 29, 2021, in a Cook County courtroom. He did not live to see it. On October 4, 2021, roughly 3 weeks before that hearing, Ronald Kleiner died in custody at Hill Correctional Center in Galesburg, Illinois. His supporters described the death as unexplained and pointed to the timing in relation to his upcoming hearing. The official cause was not publicly released by the Illinois Department of Corrections. His scheduled motion, and any ruling that might have come with it, never happened. As of today, Ronald Kleiner remains a convicted murderer under Illinois law, and the Innocence campaign that had spent decades pushing for a new trial ended when he did. Dana Rinaldi is buried in the Chicago area. Joseph Rinaldi and Michael Permanian remain in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, still serving the sentences a Cook County judge handed down almost 30 years ago. The case, as far as the state is concerned, is closed. As far as Kleiner's supporters were concerned, it never fully was. The forensic testing that had been requested in his final years, and that his supporters believed would produce a different picture of the evidence, was never completed to a conclusion the court accepted. Kleiner's case took more than 5 years to move from the killing to a grand jury indictment. The next case moved from the shooting to arrests inside a single day, but the sentences would take another 5 years to sort themselves out. Menelik Jackson. On the night of March 23, 2019, 3 young Chicago men made a series of decisions in the space of about an hour that would eventually cost one man his life and send all 3 of them to prison for a combined total of well over 150 years. The man whose life was cost was an off-duty Chicago police officer, 23 years old, sitting in his car in the River North neighborhood with his girlfriend beside him. He had done nothing to earn what was about to happen to him. His name was John Rivera, and the men in the other car had never seen him before in their lives. The night had started downtown. Menelik Jackson of South Holland, Illinois, had at one time tried to join the Chicago Police Department himself and had been unsuccessful. Jovan Battle was, at the time of the killing, homeless. Jaquan Washington had prior felony convictions for burglary and attempted burglary and was out on bond for a weapons charge. The 3 of them had ended up in an area near the former Rock and Roll McDonald's in downtown Chicago and had gotten into a physical altercation with a different group of men. That group of men was Latino. The fight ended. Jackson went to a car. He came back with a gun, and he began searching the area for the men he had just been fighting with, looking for anyone who fit the same general description. Battle, according to prosecutors, pointed out Officer Rivera's car. Rivera was sitting in the driver's seat. His girlfriend was in the passenger seat. He was not the man Jackson had been fighting with. He was not connected in any way to the earlier altercation, but he fit a description in the moment that Jackson had built in his mind. Jackson walked up to the driver's window and opened fire. Rivera shielded his girlfriend as the bullets came through the glass. He was killed. Another man in a nearby car was wounded. Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson would later call it a mistaken identity hate crime, a killing motivated by the perception that Rivera and his friends were Latino and connected to the men Jackson believed had wronged him earlier that night. Investigators recovered 8 .40 caliber shell casings from the scene. They matched a gun that would eventually be found in Jackson's possession. The physical evidence connected him to the shooting. Eyewitness accounts connected Battle to identifying the target. Washington's role, prosecutors would argue, had been to help plan and coordinate what became of the encounter. All 3 men were charged inside a matter of days. What does prosecution look like for a killing in which 3 different men made 3 different decisions, each of them essential to what happened, and each of them accountable for a different piece of the outcome? The three cases were separated. Jovan Battle went first. He represented himself at trial over the strong objections of the court. When the verdict came down, he stood up in front of the prosecutors and flipped them off and cursed at them in open court. He was convicted of first-degree murder. In March of 2021, Judge Michael Clancy sentenced him to 65 years in prison. His self-representation had not helped him. Jaquan Washington took a plea. In December of 2024, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 13 years, the lightest sentence of the three. Because he had not fired the gun and had not identified the target, but had helped set the encounter in motion. Manelik Jackson went last. In October of 2024, a Cook County jury convicted him on 5 separate charges, including first-degree murder. In April of 2025, per the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, Jackson was sentenced to 90 years in prison. His conviction was built on the ballistic evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and his own conduct on the night of the killing. As of today, Manelik Jackson, Jovan Battle, and Jaquan Washington are all in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections. Officer John Rivera is buried in the Chicago area. He had been on the Chicago Police Department for a matter of months at the time of his death, in the early part of a career he had wanted since he was a boy. The department that had briefly considered Jackson as an applicant years before would eventually be the department burying one of its youngest officers because of what Jackson chose to do on a downtown street corner in the middle of the night. Rivera's family has spoken publicly about him at every major anniversary of his death. His sister has become one of the more visible voices among the families of Chicago police officers killed on duty, speaking at memorials, at press conferences, and at the sentencings of the 3 men now in prison for what happened that night. Rivera's death came in an instant, in a car, at close range, from a man who had never met him. The next case involved another young Chicago officer killed on duty, this time on a chase that ended in the schoolyard of an elementary school. Stephen Montano. On the morning of March 1st, 2023, a Chicago police officer named Andres Vasquez Lasso responded to a domestic disturbance call in the Gage Park neighborhood on the city's southwest side. The call had come from a young woman whose boyfriend, she said, was refusing to leave her apartment. The boyfriend was carrying an illegal firearm. When officers arrived at the scene, he ran. Vasquez Lasso, 32 years old, chased him on foot into the schoolyard of Sawyer Elementary School, where children were on the playground. Within minutes, the officer had been shot 5 times, including once in the head. He was killed. The man who ran from him was Stephen Montano. He was 18 years old, and the entire encounter was captured on the officer's body camera. Montano was young. His criminal record was thin. He had been arrested once before, in 2022, on a charge of resisting or obstructing that had eventually been dismissed. His girlfriend had made the 911 call that brought officers to the apartment that morning. She had wanted him removed. He had chosen to run instead. He had a gun on him, an illegal one. He fled through streets and alleys with Vasquez Lasso closing behind him. The chase ended on the grounds of Sawyer Elementary School, near a playground where children were out that morning. Officers who arrived after the shooting would work quickly to move the scene away from any place children could see. Montano turned. He fired 5 shots. He hit Vasquez Lasso in the head, the arm, and the leg. The officer fired twice back at him before he fell. One of the officer's rounds struck Montano in the face and wounded him seriously. Vasquez Lasso died of his injuries. Montano would spend the next several weeks in a hospital bed, before being well enough to be transferred into custody at Cook County Jail. At trial, Montano testified. He said he had grown up with a deep fear of the police from prior encounters. He said he had run because he was afraid. He said he had fired because he did not want to be caught. His account was met by the officer's body camera footage, which showed the shooting from the officer's point of view, in real time, without editing. The jury watched the video. They heard Montano's explanation. They chose the video. What defense do you offer when the officer you shot recorded the entire encounter on a camera strapped to his chest? The jury did not accept the defense. On July 21, 2025, Stephen Montano was convicted of first-degree murder. On December 16th of that year, Judge John Fitzgerald Like Jr. sentenced him to natural life in prison. Because Montano had been under the age of 21 at the time of the offense, under Illinois law, he will be eligible to be considered for parole after 40 years, a legal provision that does not apply to older defendants sentenced to natural life. A prosecutor in the case called Montano the officer's angel of death. Judge Like described the killing as one of the clearest examples of a jury being given every reason to convict that he had seen. As of today, Stephen Montano is in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving the sentence Judge Like handed down. He will not be considered for parole until sometime in his late 50s at the earliest. Even at that point, parole eligibility is not parole itself. The board would have to make a separate finding. Officer Andres Vasquez Lasso is buried in the Chicago area. He was survived by his wife and his young daughter. The Chicago Police Department has honored his memory at every anniversary of his death since the day it happened, in ceremonies attended by his family, his fellow officers, and the community he had spent his career serving. Vasquez Lasso had been born in Colombia. He had moved to the United States as a young man, joined the Chicago Police Department, learned English on the job, and worked his way into a career on the streets he was killed defending. Montano's case ended almost immediately after it began, with a body camera recording and an officer down. The next case involved an officer whose own investigative work at a scene, spoken aloud in the presence of the wrong person, is what appears to have gotten him killed. Timothy Herring, Jr. On the afternoon of November 26, 2010, on the southeast side of Chicago, a Chicago police evidence technician named Michael Flisk was crouched next to a Ford Mustang that had been broken into overnight. The car belonged to a man named Stephen Peters, who was a former Chicago Housing Authority police officer and who had reported the burglary to Chicago police that morning. As Flisk worked over the vehicle, dusting for prints, he said something out loud to Peters. He said he had found a good fingerprint. The man who had broken into the car overnight had come back to the scene. He was standing close enough to hear. His name was Timothy Herring, Jr. He was 19 years old. He was on parole for a 2007 armed robbery conviction. He was wearing an ankle monitor, and when he heard Flisk say what he had found on the car, he pulled a gun and killed both men. Herring shot Flisk once in the head. He shot Peters once in the head. And then, as they lay on the ground, he detected movement from one of them and returned to the scene to shoot each of them again. Prosecutors would later call the killings execution-style, cold-blooded murder. Peters' mother lived nearby. She heard the shots. She dialed 911. Her call would later be played at trial in front of a Cook County jury and would become one of the most difficult moments of the proceedings for the officers and family members in the courtroom. Herring left the scene. Officer Michael Flisk, a veteran Chicago police evidence technician who had spent years working exactly the kind of routine crime scene call that had brought him to Burnham Avenue that afternoon, was pronounced dead at the scene. Stephen Peters, 44 years old, a man who had himself worked as a housing authority police officer, was pronounced dead as well. Two men who had spent their working lives in law enforcement had been killed within seconds of each other over what would have been, absent Herring's return to the car, a minor property crime. The investigation moved quickly. Herring's ankle monitor placed him at the scene, in real time, matching the timeline of the killings almost exactly. Physical evidence at the Mustang corroborated his presence. Ballistic evidence connected the shots. Prosecutors would eventually charge him with 2 counts of first-degree murder and burglary. The Illinois Department of Corrections would later face public questions about how a man on parole for armed robbery had been wearing an ankle monitor that was, by design, tracking him but not preventing him from returning to the scene of a crime with a gun on him. How does a case involving the shooting of a working Chicago police officer at a crime scene proceed through the courts? The trial ran to a Cook County jury in May of 2015. Prosecutors laid out the ankle monitor data, the ballistics, the physical evidence at the Mustang, and the timing of Peters's mother's 911 call. On May 6th of that year, after roughly 6.5 hours of deliberation and 1 night of sequestration, the jury returned convictions on all counts. Judge Mary Margaret Brosnahan sentenced Timothy Herring Jr. to life without parole. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Brosnahan said that there were some cases that stood out from the rest, and that this was one of them. She told Herring that he had earned each and every day of the sentence she was about to hand down. She entered the sentence in open court, and Herring was transferred out of the Cook County Jail and into the Illinois Department of Corrections. Herring appealed. In 2018, the Illinois Appellate Court affirmed the conviction in a decision cited as People v. Herring. A subsequent appeal in 2022 produced the same result. The convictions stand. There is no further appellate remedy available to him under Illinois law. As of today, Timothy Herring Jr. remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving that life without parole sentence. Officer Michael Flisk is buried in the Chicago area. Stephen Peters is buried in the Chicago area. Both men were remembered by their departments as officers who had spent their lives doing exactly what they had been trained to do until the day one of them said out loud what he had found, and the other one was standing next to him when he did. Flisk left behind a family and a career-long reputation for careful, patient evidence work. Peters left behind a mother who had heard the shots from her home nearby, and whose recorded call to 911 had been the sound that first put the investigation in motion. Herring's case turned on a single sentence spoken at a crime scene. The final case in this series turned on the newspaper. The victims answered classified ads. The man who came to their doors had chosen them by reading them. Paul Runge. In May of 1994, less than a year before he took the life of his first confirmed victim, a man named Paul Runge walked out of an Illinois prison on parole. He had been serving a 14-year sentence for a violent offense he had committed as a young person. Within a decade, he would be linked to the deaths of at least 7 women and girls across northern Illinois, and to a pattern investigators would eventually recognize by looking through classified ads for the phone numbers he had called. Runge was born in January of 1970 in Oak Forest, Illinois. As a young person, he committed the offense that sent him to prison in the first place. He served that sentence, and he was released in the spring of 1994. Within a year, his name would begin to attach to a series of cases that Illinois investigators would eventually connect together, one by one, as the deaths accumulated across the northern Illinois suburbs. The case he was ultimately convicted for was the killing, in February of 1997, of a Chicago woman named Yolanda Gutierrez and her daughter. Runge had made contact with Yolanda through a classified ad she had placed. On February 3, 1997, first responders arriving at the family's home discovered that both of them had lost their lives inside. Investigators recovered physical evidence at the scene that would eventually be linked to Runge through DNA testing, in an analysis that would not be completed for several more years. Runge would later confess on videotape to taking the lives of 7 women and girls in total, including sisters named Amela and Zaneta Pasanbegovic, who had been in their 20s. He described a pattern in which he used classified ads to identify potential victims, contacted them under the pretext of buying items or looking at homes, and then took their lives once he had gained access to them. Investigators, working backward through phone records and newspaper filings, would eventually match his pattern to case after case that had gone unsolved for years. What does a case look like when the defendant has confessed on tape and the physical evidence points in a single direction? Runge's trial went to a Cook County jury in February of 2006. His defense was insanity. The jury rejected it. He was convicted, and he was sentenced to death. It was one of the last death sentences Cook County would hand down under Illinois' pre-abolition capital punishment system. In May of 2009, the Illinois Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in a 4-3 decision, with a majority opinion written by Justice Lloyd Carmeier. Justice Ann M. Burke wrote a dissent arguing that jury impartiality concerns warranted a new trial. The dissent did not carry the day. Runge remained on death row. In 2011, Illinois abolished capital punishment. Governor Pat Quinn commuted the death sentences of every man then on Illinois' death row, including Runge, to life in prison without parole. Prosecutors in Cook County and then prosecutors in DuPage County, faced with the reality that no harsher sentence than life was available under state law, moved to dismiss the remaining murder charges against Runge. Those dismissals were granted. The rest of the confirmed victims would not have their day in a Cook County or DuPage County courtroom, because there was no additional punishment the state could add to what Runge was already serving. For the families of those other victims, the abolition of the death penalty in Illinois carried a legal consequence they had not necessarily expected. As of today, Paul Runge is serving natural life without parole at Pontiac Correctional Center in central Illinois, under Illinois Department of Corrections identification number N84715. He is not eligible for parole under any provision of Illinois law. He has, according to publicly available records, no documented disciplinary incidents, no staff assaults, and no behavioral write-ups on file in the 20 years he has been in state custody. Yolanda Gutierrez and her daughter are buried in the Chicago area, along with the other women whose families had done nothing but answer a phone call about an ad in a newspaper. The pattern Runge followed, of scanning classified sections for phone numbers, has since become a case study cited in investigative training on how a single overlooked link between unsolved cases can be the thing that eventually closes them all. These 10 cases represent one narrow slice of the record the Cook County criminal justice system has built over the course of 6 decades. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.